Hi, everybody. I would like to thank Sophia and her great team for the organization of this big, beautiful event. Given all the difficulties we are facing with pandemics, this is really a miracle that we are all together here talking about miracles. And I also would like to thank Nelida for the previous presentation that is very convenient for what I'm going to talk now. I also would like to thank my collaborators for this presentation. They are part of a research group that is on in an interaction with people from Argentina, from University of Buenos Aires, the computer department, from France, also from Spain, people from USP, Unicamp, UFABC. It's a real interdisciplinary project. It's been going on for 3 years. And this group of collaborators is just a small set of this big group, which I would like to thank in this project that is being financed by FAPESP since 2017. The topics is the dynamics of opinion and language under the influence of big data. And it is in this context that I would like to talk about epistemological implications of virtual realism. So thank you for your audience. So we have this problem. What could be the possible epistemological consequences of virtual realism, particularly Chalmers' virtual realism, that now is grounded upon big data? What is the possible epistemological consequence, particularly in human perception? And I'm going to go on this problem. I don't have a solution for that. I would like to think with you on that. I will go on 3 steps. First, I'll present a brief introduction to David Chalmers' virtual realism. I think it's familiar to many of us. Then in step 2, I'm going to go straight on to point out some positive and negative epistemological consequence of this virtual realism. And finally, I'm going to leave you with a problem. I'm a specialist in leaving people with problems. So virtual realism in face of big data, deep fake, I think is coming for a renewed analytic philosophy agenda, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to leave with you this problem. So first for David Chalmers' virtual realism, in the paper, The Virtual and Digital, published now in a Disputatio special issue, where David Chalmers has several critics and he answers to the critics. He summarized his main thesis. The first one is that virtual objects are real digital objects. And they are put in the form of events. So events in virtual worlds are digital events. So the notion of digital objects here is very important. And what are these events? He says involves virtual properties and they are really instantiated. If we could give an example, is what we have now. We have this event that is virtual. We are operating at the virtual level. And the third supposition is that experience in virtual reality involves non-illusory perception of digital world. And, hopefully, we are not hallucinating now. So this virtual reality is non-illusory. That's one of his points. And I put a fourth thesis in red because I think we have to discuss about that. He says that virtual experience are as valuable as non-virtual experience in the domain of perception of non-digital world. We will talk about that because I don't know exactly what he meant by valuable, but I have several restrictions about that. So the point is that to focus on, to try to understand what are these digital objects. So he says, he presents four senses, at least 4 senses from what I could gather, about digital objects. They are, in the first, and he says narrow sense, I'm quoting him, digital objects. They are kind of zeros and one in a computational systems. In the second sense, that's the most relevant ones, we have digital object as a kind of data structure. That's a computational object constituted by the first narrow sense, but it still can be individuated computationally. In the third sense, a digital object includes all other objects grounded in data structure, and but they have to be not necessarily individuated computationally. So it seems that he's generalizing his point. And in the fourth sense, that's where I'm going to focus on later on, is that a digital object includes not only all the third ones, the second, third, and sense. They are all grounded in data structure, but also they involve mental properties. So that's for Chalmers' main thesis. And we can see that virtual realism and virtual reality is grounded in data structure. So what are these data structure? We see that from the computational perspective, they are organizations of data given in specific purpose. But he says here they are composed of structures, just data structures. And what is relevant here is that in turn, this data structure have the power to cause sensorial and spatial experience under special conditions for experienced users of VR. So for instance, you are listening to me, seeing you in the screen, some of you, and this has causal, sensory, and spatial experience. For us, maybe somebody who never interacted with computers would not understand what's going on. But for us, it seems just a normal, more or less normal kind of experience. So we have to understand what is this data structure. As I mentioned in the computer science, and David Chalmers used in part of his replies to the critics, the definition of Wikipedia. There is a data organization that involves management, storage, and format that enables efficient access and can be modified, involves motivation. Chalmers is interested not in the abstract notion of data organization, even though, as we saw in his third realization, he looks for a little bit of generalization of this. He is interested in the notion of data structure that is a realization of abstract data structure in physical systems. And why he needs this realization? Because as a physical data structure, he claims, data structure has the power to cause sensorial and spatial experience under normal conditions for users of virtual realism. So if he was working only with the abstract traditional computational notion, he would have problems to keep with this causal, sensorial, and spatial experience. Even though he flirts with the panpsychism, he would have problems with this unless he interested in this physical realization of data structure. I hope it's clear. So I'm going to summarize this view. So very briefly, according to Chalmers, then virtual objects are real digital objects, and they constitute these really digital events. So the notion of events is important here, which in turn allows non-illusory perception of digital world. So we are all sharing the idea that we are not hallucinating here. We are not under the effect of hallucinatory perception in this interaction. And this type of virtual experience, as I mentioned, he claims that can be as valuable as non-virtual experience of a non-digital world. I mentioned I don't agree with him at this point. I don't understand exactly what he means by valuable, but it's for me obvious that the non-digital experience, perceptual, is so much richer, much more complex than the virtual experience. So I am an adept of ecological psychology, and the non-virtual experience in perceptual level involves affordance, world that takes a lot of evolutionary path, in a sense that is just filtered by virtual experience. So they cannot be as valid as the digital ones. But we can discuss that later on. Let's go now for this part 2 and see what are the positive and negative epistemological consequences of Chalmers' virtualism and the digital transformations in the human perception world. So let's first talk about the positive epistemological consequence. Several people here mentioned Gilbert Ryle. I think Samantha just mentioned them. I liked very much Ryle. I think he brought incredible, valuable, extremely valuable elements for analytic philosophy and also for pragmatism and practical philosophy, with his distinction between knowing how and knowing that. Most of us are familiar with the idea of knowing how to do things. It's a kind of operative knowledge that expresses the ability to properly perform an action. And I stress here properly, this notion of properly, the skill, the ability to properly perform an action is going to be very relevant for the third part of our talk. So I think this distinction between knowing how, the emphasis particularly, and the distinction between knowing how and knowing that is important for the applications in the 20th century. With knowing how, it seems clear to me that virtual realism allows extremely fertile investigation of knowing how to properly perform a given action in a virtual environment for users of VR, virtual realism, whenever they want. And what is strange is whenever they don't want, act in a proper manner as well. So an example of these abilities is this notion of technoforwarders. Mariana Broins, Artur Gonzalez, and Gio Kobayashi, we proposed this notion of technoforwarders. That is a kind of functional second-order emergent property of perception action systems. And they allow information that emergent from this interaction between human and machines. They allow opportunities for browsing actions. For example, in the case of GPS, for people who like GPS and they direct their actions in the environment, this is ability, knowing how, if they know properly how to operate with that, this seems to be a good event, a good advance in this virtual universe. But what would be now the negative consequence? It seems to me that virtual realism might open up space for dispositions towards mindless, mechanical perception action. And of course, you're going to see this happens independent of virtual realism, it's true. But let's see what happens with the virtual realism. Sorry. We can see with this jokey picture here that digital recommendation systems are very effective in affecting people's self-perception. We have lots of teenagers becoming very slim, having marks in their arms. The self-perception now is deeply affected by this digital recommendation. They affect even what people eat and the self-image. If you are not very familiar with these elements, you may feel completely stupid, a moron. And this is just one image, one example of this, what I call negative effects of this virtual realism. But things become still worse when we go on with disguiser problems. One member of our research team, Gil Kobayashi from UFABC, he gave us this program, he illustrates that, in which it's not possible if someone is using the disguiser program, it's not possible to know if the person is the real person you're talking, or is an artificial person, or which parts are real and which parts are not real of what you see in the screen. Even for experienced people with virtual reality, the viewer has no way of knowing if it is a disguiser program being used. So Gil gave this example. Suppose that somebody who is an expert in this universe is an old pedophile, and he wants to interact with little kids. So he disguises himself in a way that he changes his appearance, he looks like a girl, he looks like, he changes his voice, and the dialogue, and he appears in the screen, and the girl on the other side, or the boy on the other side, thinks that it's interacting with the real person. But in fact, it is an illusion. It's not interacting with the real person. This can be interesting for a policeman to hands into pedophiles, but if we're not interested in policemen, as I'm not, the point here is how can we really deal with these non-illusory elements, given that people, expertise technicians from the universe, computer universe, can operate with this disguiser program. So we talk about the individual level, but at the collective level, perception becomes a little bit worse. The spread of fake news, we are familiar with that, but the deep fake that works in general as a confirmation bias, in some cases with the deep fake, the news has real content, but it's out of context or is jokingly presented. I put here an example of the Pelosi video. I'm not going to show it here because my computer power doesn't allow me, my competence also doesn't allow me. But if you are interested in see this Pelosi video, the content of this video is authentic. She's saying exactly what in the real world, but its playback speed has been altered to make Nancy Pelosi to look like drunk, under the effects of drugs, calming, or black stripe medicines. So there is this deep fake news in which the people watching the video thinks, haha, she's a drunkard. I'm not going to support her. Particularly if you are one of these fanatic religious, you are going to say, oh, I knew she is a drunkard. And this news spread very, very quickly. So you could be thinking, well, this fake news or even deep fake is not new. it's been around for centuries. We have this picture of somebody who wants to operate always on the basis of confirmation bias. He hears something, he goes on there, and haha, I found that it is the case. So in a book, in the magazine, whatever. The difference is that now, with the real virtualism and digital environment, this is spread for billions of people with an incredible speed. While, for instance, if fake news about you comes with your neighbor or in your school or whatever, in the past was just close to your environment. Now it spreads around millions of people very quickly, and you cannot change your image. So your self-perception is affected. People's perception about you is also affected very, very quickly. So this is a negative aspect of virtual realism. And just to summarize, in the individual and collective aspects, we have then this positive side of virtual realism that might allow fertile investigations of knowing how to operate in the virtual environment for experienced users that are honest, that really wanted to expand the universe of knowledge. But on the negative side, virtual realism might allow dispositions to spread of misinformation, deepfake, and confirmation bias, not only for users of digital space, but all around you. So how about science? What's the effect of virtual realism in science? Nelly that read all this discussion on the topic of correlations and causality. Also, the speakers today talk about the topic of correlations versus causality. And this is we say that is selling as hotcakes now here in the big data environment. As this message of Gray in 2009, it's already more than 10 years, he announced that we are experiencing science the emergence of a fourth paradigm in which science is based on data. For our surprise, more or less, Floridi also stresses this point. Luciano Floridi, he initially spreads in 2017 this paradox. He was experienced. I don't think he's experienced anymore. And he asked, should abandon now naturalism in science? And I am going to read his quote here. It says, in the increasing and profound technologization of science, that's creating a tension between what we try to explain, namely all sorts of realities, and how we explain it through highly artificial constructs and devices that frame and supports investigations. He says naturalistic explanations are increasingly dependent on non-natural means to reach such explanations. And he suggests that kind of informational constructivism. This informational constructivism indicates a big change in philosophical and scientific view, particularly on the topic of causality versus correlation. So in a more pamphletary way, we have Chris Anderson saying more recently in this paper, the data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. He claims that, I'm quoting, scientists are trained to recognize that correlation is not causation, that no conclusion should be drawn simply on the basis of correlation between X and Y. It could be just a coincidence. Instead, as the tradition would say, you must understand the underlying mechanism that connects the two. Once you have a model, you can then connect it, the data, that data set with confidence. So the moral of the tradition would be data without a model is just noise. But, and the but is important here, he says, faced with massive data, this approach to science that goes on from hypothesize, model, test is becoming obsolete. This is 2008, and it's going on and on in the science. In the same paper, he claims, with enough data, the numbers speaks for themselves. Petabytes allow us to say correlation is enough. We can stop looking for models. So we don't need models, we don't have theories anymore, just look for correlations. This seems like a joke, but many people reply to that, and there are lots of people going on adopting this attitude. So the main representatives of this vision that correlation is much better than causality in science is this paper, this book by Mayer, Schoenberg, and Cooker, as Big Data, a revolution that will transform how we live, work, and think. In this book, from chapter to the end, they claim that with big data development, correlation rather than causality, an important predictive role in science. Not only in science, they give hints to policemen, to work of espionage. All you need is to have a good big data analytics. So just to summarize this, saying that these views, both by Anderson, Mayer, and Schoenberg, and Cooker, they counter an epistemological conception of science, according to which the scientific method allows tests and hypotheses based on law-like causal relationship. And as Nelly and all the others stressed, even though every causal relationship also involves a correlation between elements in a chain or in a network, at least in science, there is an attempt to detect causal relationships by eliminating spurious correlations. Even if you are not a realist, you don't want spurious correlations. So with big data, I think it's very hard to go on from correlations to causal explanations. Not impossible. There are several people working on that as well. But due to the methods adopted in general by research in this area, they just really don't care about causality. They wanted to focus on correlation. So what is then this big data that gives such a power for all these scientists and people working in the virtual universe? There are several definitions of big data. That term was coined in 2005, and now there are several definitions, but they all considered that the main dimensions of big data is that it's a huge volume of data with a huge variety, recorded with an incredible velocity. And now people are concerned with veracity, but it's not always the case. It's a very variability. You can go from corpora in several different environments. And also, it's important, particularly for people interested in economics, aspect the value of this data. They steal all our data because it has value. So these properties are considered the main dimensions of big data. And they stressed, people working with this, particularly Gandom and Hyder, that big data, all this huge amount of data, are worthless in a vacuum. They're just noise. It is potential value. is unlocked only when leveraged to drive decision making. So we have to focus on the decision making. So data management involves efficient process to turn volumes of fast-moving data and diverse data in meaningful insights. So I prepared for other occasions this summary of big data that's very simplistic, but that's the saying that big data process involves sub-process. First, as data management, all these billion trillions of data should be recorded, then should be cleaned. The beauty of interdisciplinary interaction with people from computer science is that we learned how this cleaning is so boring, so tedious, and so difficult. You have to, all these words that has to be cleaned, and once you cleaned all these words, you then integrate them and do the representation. Once you have done all this process, then you go on to the predictive analysis. Some people, not too many, are interested in modeling, and then interpret that. So just to summarize and go on to the final part, I stressed so far that the digital environment incremented by these big data techniques might allow extremely fertile investigations of knowing how to operate with correlations in the scientific realm for people honest and really interested in knowledge. But it also allows these positions to spread misinformation, fake news, and reinforcement of perceptual bias, which directly affects our self-perception and public perception. But what is concerned for us here now is that on these concepts of correlation, or the debate correlation versus causality, under development in perspective of big data studies, is indicating since 2008 the emergence of a new rationality in science and common sense. And this is object of our final part, in which we wanted to know about the consequence of this big transformation that's going on, and if it is related to what is of object of analysis of analytical science and analytic philosophy. So what we have here, going back to Chalmers and to our initial problem. Replying to one of his...
Anisi, okay, you have still 8 minutes.
Okay, I'm finishing.
Okay.
Chalmers agrees with Cripp that, I quote, what a programmer system is running depends on intended function. Just to summarize here, it may depend, all these computational entities may depend on social facts, so that objects may be essentially social after all. And Chalmers says, strictly speaking, I agree with that his vision of virtual realism is compatible with that. So given that data structures depend on computational intended function that themselves depends on social influence, how to guarantee that this knowing how to operate in virtual space, now incremented by big data analytics, would prevent the virtual experience of illusory perception of digital objects as claimed by Chalmers. In short, how to guarantee de facto information of data structure and the objectivity of the user's perceptions. So just a matter of bringing you problems as a matter of conclusion. Do we need a renewed analytical philosophy agenda? We presented you all the negative and positive epistemological implications of embracing Chalmers' virtual realism, now incremented by big data analytics. Virtual realism, of course, might help with modeling, even though many of them are not interested in modeling, but it might help. And the understanding of possible types of scientific problems and in possible different worlds. It's a very rich tool. But given the complexity of this universe and the beauty of this interaction with people from different areas, we understand that the fast development of virtual environments, incremented with big data studies, the epistemological implications of virtual realism indicates the need for a renewed agenda for analytic philosophy that includes ethical problems in this research. And just as a matter of conclusion, then back to Ryle. I discovered a beautiful article in the Journal of Analytical Philosophy 2020 by Matt Dougherty, and he says Ryle and the ethical impetus for know-how. Matt argues that Ryle, in addition to his motive of discounting certain theories of philosophy of mind, his interest in the notion of know-how, I quote, also stemmed from two ethical interests. One concerned his own interests as a philosopher, and also whether the philosopher has any meaningful task in his life. Do we have any meaningful task, or we're just intellectuals? And one concerning the ancient issue of whether virtue is a kind of knowledge. And Ryle says know-how is crucial in both respects. And inspired by Ryle's ethical impetus for know-how, I would like just to bring to you, my last slide, a proposal for a renewed analytic philosophy agenda that should or could incorporate as a general recommendation the following: that virtual realism and all the research around that should be guided by ethical principles grounded on norms, methods, and rules generated by sustainable interactions of social, political, and ecological agents. I know this is not very familiar to us in analytical philosophy, but I think in the 21st century, an interdisciplinary philosophical research should focus also on the development of virtual realism's main presupposition and its relation to knowing how, Ryle's knowing how to create in the digital world, especially in relation to the methods under analysis in the domain of big data. And just then, I don't think, maybe I shouldn't remember, but this is above suggestion is only an open gate designed to initiate a line of reflection with you without my directions remain uncertain. I don't know where we are going to head out. So thank you very much. Obrigada. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Eunice. I am sorry I haven't presented you in English, but we will translate it afterwards.
That's okay.
So
okay.
Thank you
Not
very much for the very new and interesting data and research. So we are open for questions. So Domingos Faria has a question, and then Juliet Floyd. Domingos.
Great. Thank you a lot for this talk. It was amazing. And I have a question for you. It's mainly a clarificatory question. You said that virtual realism might allow spread the fake news, the virtual realism can have negative effects. But we can also make the distinction between real objects outside virtual reality and digital objects inside virtual reality. And my question is the following. That distinction seems that allow us to correct the bad effects of virtual realism. Do you agree? If you have a good distinction between objects that are inside of virtual reality and objects outside of that virtual reality, we can prevent the bad effects that you claim?
Thank you very much for your question. I think it's extremely relevant, and the relevance comes from the topic that we should now try to differentiate the virtual domain from the natural domain. But as Floridi says, even in science, every day more, we have the influence of the virtual realism. So it's going to be a task for the 21st new scientists and philosophers to do exactly what suggests. How are we going to differentiate that? How can we save the virtual realism at the same time keeping feet a big grounded in reality? The tools available in digital universe, we are learning with this very rich experience with people from a project financed by FAPESP on the topic of the dynamics of opinion and language under the influence of big data. Is such a complex universe. We have a strong team from computer science, from physics, from philosophers, from information science, and we are really confronting serious problems to differentiate the natural environment in the domain of information and the virtual one. So I thank you for your question. That is for the young people now to start to think about it. Thank you very much.
Juliet?
Yes, thank you, Maria, for an absolutely inspiring talk. And I'm really very excited by the research you're doing. And I completely agree that this is the agenda for analytic philosophy in the 21st century. We have to be very interdisciplinary and diverse in what we do. And I also think that it's obvious that the normative, the issues you talked about in connection with Ryle and virtue ethics, you know, individuals will have to find their way, find a path through this jungle. And it's going to take an awful lot of effort from an awful lot of different fields to take care of this. So I had a grant to work on sort of philosophical ideas connected with emerging media from the Mellon Foundation for 3 years. And we had several conferences on deep fakes and algorithms and bias in algorithms and how that affects what you call the integrative step. After you've cleaned the data, you then have to integrate the data. The way it's integrated involves algorithms, but those algorithms, when we place them in a social world, are often very biased. And in the United States, there's a lot of research now on bias in algorithms, the ways in which social structures are formed and reinforced through algorithms that involve credit ratings and other things. So I think we need an army of young people to come out and study, particularly social media. Social media is the setting within which a lot of science takes place. We have conspiracy theories that need to be studied. A lot of history should be known, but then we need to respect the big data. So I'm basically just clapping for your talk, but I did want to mention on the ethics that there is a large grant now, an ERC grant that Sandra Logier has gotten in France. It connects work in about 6 different countries, and I'm involved in this. This is to look at ethics of popular media, and in particular TV shows. So I wanted to ask you whether you would go as far as this. We're very interested in how moral dilemmas are played out in TV series, which seem to form something like the novels of our time. People watch them at home, they discuss them with people that they watch. These TV series form communities and so on. So do you think that the Rilleyan idea about virtue, involve philosophers in a study of popular culture and how popular culture is actually being used, for example, by security agencies? Because some of these TV series like Homeland or Bureau de Légende or Fauda in Israel, these TV shows have to do with the paranoia of people living in a big data-driven world. And the question is whether I think you're right, there's a positive and a negative side always to the ways in which these media amplify goodness and badness. So anyway, I'm really just clapping, but I wondered about integrating beyond philosophy of science, this idea of popular culture and popular media, social media.
Thank you very much for your question. I adore your talk, particularly at the end, when you brought the question of the collective with touring certain topics that would be relevant to involve the collectivity. So I agree completely with you that we should bring all other areas of people, because now science is not just at the top. In fact, there are lots of movement against science now. Mm-hmm. And this digital world is spreading, and so we need to give hands with a popular science or whatever. Always philosophers like Ryle trying to find out the right kind of knowledge. We know it's very difficult at all this topic. The discussion on causality versus correlation indicates the difficulties, but I think Ryle brings the message that time, even if he was not dealing with, of course, with virtual reality, it's time for us now to think about the ethical aspects of knowledge and get involved with an interdisciplinary team. That's what we are doing with this big data project. That's a transatlantic project financed by FAPESP that has many other countries. And people from communication science, for instance, from Spain, are giving us lots of insights, together with people from UFABC, Unicamp, USP. They are all joining hands with UNESCO for this sort of research that, as Sophia says, I'm always ahead of time. I don't know, it's my karma, as they say, but it is what I can do at the moment. So thank you very much for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you both. So we have a question written on the chat, Maria Eunice.
Can you read for me?
From Tamar. Yes, I can read it. Many thanks, Eunice. What do you make of artificial general intelligence in light of Chalmers' virtual realism? Do you think it would ever be able to maximize good consequences given the contradictions, inconsistencies, and shortcomings of real-life ethical challenges?
Thanks, Tamar. This is a very extremely relevant question for me. There is one passage of Wiener says that there is a problem people working with computers, that computers in general are much faster than humans in processing information. And it may come the time, Wiener was an expert on this, that we won't be able to go ahead with the conclusion or with the productions of the machines. At the moment, for instance, with deep fake and deep learning, we are already losing the feet with what is going on. Sometimes so many layers, hidden layers in a program that we don't know what really the machine is doing. So it may be that we lost, as we will be lost, as Wiener suggests. But I am really an optimist, and I think it's important to be lost so you can find your path. And Ryle's suggestion about the ethical view is my strong suggestion to be included in the renewed analytic philosophy agenda. Without this ethical concern of how to properly act or do research, we are lost. But if we are concerned with ethical principles as well, I don't think we will be totally lost. So thank you very much for your talk, for your question.
Someone else want to have a question?
Jefferson made a comment on the chat.
Could you please read it?
Yes, now I see it. I wasn't seeing it. Okay. Jefferson. Hi, Jefferson.
Do you want to say it?
Do you want to read it for Maria Eunice?
Could you please?
Thank you. So I can read it. Thank you for your talk, Professor Eunice. Is my first contact with this Chalmers paper. So I would like to ask, you think that phenomena like Zoom fatigue does not create problems to Chalmers' virtual realism that seems to be a there seems to be a materiality in social interactions that may make the value of the experiences different?
Yes, this is a important point. You notice that when I presented Chalmers, he insisted in that he's talking about realization, implementation of virtual reality. He saw your point, I guess, and he claims that when we are working with implementations in a physical computer systems, then we can have certain control upon the situation. So it's not completely lost, the control of the situation. Then if we keep feet grounded in reality, in natural, in environment, in ecological environment, then we can somehow learn how to deal with the difficulty you are mentioning. Thank you.
One last question from Jonatas Villanova. Thank you for the great talk. I would like to know if you take big data correlations as being part of what sciences should explain, or as something that explains phenomena. In other words, it is enough to just point to correlations as doing explanatory work.
So the beauty of our work in our research team is that it's totally interdisciplinary. We have people from computer science, from physics, from communication, from philosophy, and we learned with hard work that this programming and this filtering of data is extremely relevant and can be easily biased. So to answer your question, I think we should, as a philosopher, try at least to have some ideas how this world of computing, virtual realism operates, so we will not be disguised or be under delusion that whatever it happens is not a fake news or is not a deep fake. So provided that we have these interdisciplinary interactions, can maybe go ahead in search for knowledge in a kind of sound and grounded way. That's what is my hope, at least. Thanks.
So I thank you again, Maria Anisi, for your participation, for accepting our invitation for this meeting. And it has appeared another question here. Yeah, I think we have still some minutes. So do you want to answer a last one? Yes? So Felipe Aleuterio is asking, my question goes in the direction of the assumption made at the beginning. Don't you think that when social interaction is mediated by virtual realism, but in specific contexts, naturalized, so to speak, the technology would actually not limit interpersonal recognition, video games, deep fakes that are used specifically as a joke, as memes, in contexts of expected use of the technologies, wouldn't the virtual scenario actually be positive as the current context of the pandemic itself? It seems to be very rare that the interested people in scientific events will confuse what is expected from them to do in the internet, for example. Don't you think? Thanks.
So, Felipe, thank you for your questions. I presented the positive aspect of virtual realism. No doubt is a precious task, tool for us, but it allows all sorts of deepfake. It's a pity that we couldn't go on with this deepfake that presents somebody with a completely distorted voice, and the content of the speech is absolutely true. It's exactly what the person is saying, is speaking, but her voice makes her look like drunk or completely nuts, because that was intended to damage her image. And what is strange is that many people watching this view believe it. They kept saying, I will leave it, the address for you here. They say, we knew that she was a liar and blah, blah, blah. So even in scientific environments, we are deemed to be under big illusions, depending on the size of our ego. Thank you very much. So it's a good tool, but we have to be very critical about it.
Thank you, Anisi. So I thank you also Nelly Da Gentile, who was here, and all the participants and who made questions. Thank you very much all, and have a good lunch right now.
So thank you. Thank you.